Hello there, if you've not met me before, I'm Jo from Minerva and today I'm here to do a sew along for a Harlow top, which is a floaty sleeve top from the pattern house Style Arc. If you've not used Style Arc patterns before, you might know or have heard that the instructions are quite limited. They sort of assume that you've already sewn before, which is okay if you have, but if you haven't, then I'm going to show you some of the terminology and some of the vocab that might help you to get your way through a Style Arc pattern and maybe choose another one. I'm making the Harlow top today from one of our Minerva kits. So this is where the pattern and the fabric has been chosen for you and all the notions that you need to complete the garment are in one kit. It's a really great way of not having lots of waste products and lots of waste fabric. You get just the right amount, you get all the things you need, and you can get sewing straight away. The Harlow top is a shell top with a floating sleeve. So it's got bust darts, a sort of swinging hem, not too big, not too wide, and it's got this floating sleeve that's got a slit, so it makes this sort of graceful sleeve shape. The fabric suggestions for this are a silk or a linen or any light crepe fabric, and we've chosen a viscose challis one from our Minerva range, like this one here. The fabric I've chosen is a white one for the kit because I would sort of advise you to have a fabric that looks quite similar on the back than it does on the front, because when you have the floating sleeve you can see inside the floating sleeve. So if you have a dark fabric like this one, you would see that colour on the inside of the sleeve. So I've chosen this whiter one so that what you see on the inside is also a complementary shade. So that's just something to think about if you want to choose the Harlow top but you're going to choose your own fabric. Take a look at our Minerva fabric reels and you will see the maker show you the inside of the fabric, so you can get a good idea of what the reverse of the fabric looks like. The contents of the kit are listed below, so if you hover over them it will put all of those items into the basket and you can delete as necessary. So if you already have the pattern you can take that out, or if you've got a new packet of sewing machine needles you can switch that in or out. Okay, let's take a look at the pattern. There's one or two things you need to know about a Style Arc pattern if you've not used one before. One is the writing is really small, so I need to wear my glasses to give you some information. So this is the instructions. So that's the pattern cover. That's the instructions. And there's an assembly diagram. Sometimes there's diagrams of trickier parts or parts that might need an image to help you complete it. But the instructions are just that list of writing there in the middle. The first thing to do with any pattern is to read it all the way through. With a Style Arc pattern you'll get some specific information in the helpful hints section before you start to sew. The thing that you need to know from this is the seam allowance, which is 1 centimetre throughout, and 1/4 inch or 6 mil on any neck finishes. You need to interface the neck pieces, and you also need to make sure that you're using the grain lines on the pattern so that your fabric moves how you want it, especially on the sleeve. So don't just squeeze that sleeve shape in anywhere on the fabric. You need the grain line to be running in the right way so that your fabric drapes correctly on the sleeve. Here's how I cut out. There's a few tips along the way, and then we can start to sew. I'm pitching today's video at a confident beginner. So it's a shell top essentially with some floaty sleeves. You could use the pattern just as a shell top and shorten the sleeves, but I'm going to do the whole top today in case you want to know how to do all the finishes on the sleeves. If you're using visco challis, it's advisable to put a new needle into your sewing machine because if you use a blunt sewing machine needle, you'll get shots in your fabric and you'll get little white lines running through the weave. So put a new needle in so you get a clear stab on each needle insert, and then you can get a good seam line. Number one is super easy. You're going to put the darts in your front piece. So fold your darts along the dart line. Sew from the wide end to the bust apex. Do one little stitch, tie the threads off and press your darts downwards. Number two is with right sides facing, sew the front and back shoulder seams together. It's always a bit tempting just to whiz through this part of the pattern because it seems so simple, which it is, but I would suggest that you try it on after you've done that. Just drape it over your shoulder, find where the neck is lying and the back is lying, and just check that your shoulder seam, you can see mine there because it's cutting that flower, that your shoulder seam is running where you want it, because if it's too far back, your back neck will gape, and if it's too far forward, you'll have a twisted arm, so you'll get lots of sort of gathers at the front of your arm. And the arm fit on this is quite fitted. This has got a little bit of a drop shoulder, but you've got quite a fitted arm shape there. So you will notice that the shoulder seam isn't very wide at all. So although we've cut it out now, but really, if you want to make this a couple of times, make your first one, see what happens. You might find you need to lengthen that, because if it's coming up short, you won't have room for your sleeve head. So although on a pattern, right sides together, sew the shoulder seams, always seems like a bit of a whiz through part of the pattern, it's actually a really crucial part of how the garment hangs from you. Don't forget, seam allowance is 1 centimetre, and you need to keep that throughout so that your neck facings fit. You can see when I put it on, the shoulder seam is lying here. You can see that it's a very narrow shoulder. My shoulders are sticking out quite a bit further than the top. So we'll see what happens when we put the sleeve head in. We might, if we make this again, make an alteration to our pattern piece and add 1 centimetre on there, because we've got our seam allowance, but we'll see what it looks like. But I really advise that you try it on yourself before you go any further. Number 3 is to sew the centre back seam. There's a notch so that you can put a little button at the top to help you get it over your head. You might find, again, if you've made a toile or this is your second go, that you don't need the button. It might go over your head without it, but you stop here and you press that seam open so that you have an open seam along the back, and then you have these open folds at the top ready to make the slit for the button. Number 4 is to start working on the facings. So the facings were interfaced at my cutting stage. I've overlocked around the edge, but you can zigzag around there. But once you've got interfacing on it, it doesn't fray so much. Challis might fray a bit more, so finish around the edge. Join the shoulder seams, so you can imagine that's the neck shape. And you've also got to join the lower centre back seam, and it doesn't seem completely obvious unless you've remembered to mark the notches. So there are notches at the bottom of the back neck facing, and you join them together, and you've just got to sew that tiny last bit of the back facing. Press that open and you will have a complete facing unit. Because Style Arc patterns have only got a small amount of instructions, sometimes there's a lot of steps in one step. So with right sides together, pin the neck facing to the neck body once in place, stitch on, turn to the right side and then sew a flat stitch close to the seam. And flat stitch is an Australian term for understitching. So the one instruction puts all of this on in one go. So let's do it in small stages. So with right sides together, pin the shoulder seams. Don't forget, you've only got a 6mm seam allowance for the neckline, so make sure you remember that, because you've used a 1cm seam allowance on the sides. It says turn right side out, but I suggest you do a bit of fabric handling before you do that. So I'm going to take off some excess seam allowance here. I'm going to do the same on this side. This will mean I won't get a sort of chunky lump on my shoulder. And I'm also going to clip the curves so that I get a smooth neck edge, especially along the front. It doesn't say all these, because if you'd been sewing a while you would know to do this anyway, so they don't put it in the instructions. So clip the neck, not going through the stitching of course. And the next stage is to understitch. Take your top over to the ironing board, give it a press, and press your seam allowances up towards the facing. So when you get to the ironing board, press your seam allowance this way, away from the top. You might need to use a press cloth, because if you're pressing on the wrong side, you don't want to melt your interfacing that you've got really neatly in place. To understitch, you have the facing flat and the top flat, right sides up, and all of that seam allowance should be pointing up towards the facing. And you're going to take a stitch line along here, not on the top, on the facing. So you're making a sandwich of facing and all the seam allowances. You need to keep it as close to the edge as you can, 1 or 2 millimeters, and keep all of that seam allowance touching the facing. And that's called understitching, and it makes a really neat neckline finish, because it stops your facing rolling to the front of your top. And because it makes a sort of thick ridge here, your top sort of hangs off that ridge, gives it a little coat hanger. There are lots of different ways to make a roller loop, but the easiest way is to fold your little piece of fabric in half and have a really long tail of machine thread, so that you can use that thread to pull a really narrow roller loop through. Another thing to do is to take off as much of the seam bulk as you can, because that will get you a narrower and a narrower roller loop. Use the long tail, thread it through a needle, and then put the needle all the way through the roller loop. You can also just top stitch it as well if you want to, and that holds it nice and flat, so you can get it around your button without it sort of ballooning out. Okay, let's find the placement for that, which is on the back neck facing. Right, from the wrong side, you're going to make your loop. I know that up to those black marks is where I need, but you need to make sure that your loop goes inside. So you don't want it sticking out like that so you can see it, because when you turn it out the right way, those will be the bits that you see. So you need it to be that loop going into and sandwiched between the facing and the top. Make sure it's big enough to get your button in. You can put a pin in the 1 centimetre seam allowance here, and you could have a little test to check that your button will go through. Yep. And now, using that 1 centimetre seam allowance that we left from all those pressed open seams, I'm going to sew up the back seam. So you should be able to line up the raw edges. I had a little crease line from the press, when I press the seam open, so I've got a nice little fold line to follow. And I'm going to sew the seam on the inside, then turn it to the right side and top stitch it. When it's top stitched, it's all nice and neat, and your button goes at the end. It's important, if you've got a rolly loop, that you have a shanked button. So the shank buttons in the kit, and they've got a little thick bit on the back, a little shoulder on the back, and that gives you enough room to get your rolly loop over the button. So that's the top made. Let's think about the statement sleeves. The sleeve comes in 2 parts. So there is the bell-shaped drape that goes along the bottom, and there is the sleeve for the upper sleeve. You need to mark the notches because the sleeve head is not in the centre, it's slightly to one side, and you need that to be right, because if your sleeve head isn't right on your shoulder seam, so that, going back now to talking about that shoulder line being in the right place, that's where your sleeve head will be. And if you're going to hang the weight of this bell sleeve, you don't want it to be pulling your sleeve forwards or backwards. The other thing to know about the sleeve is you want the upper sleeve to be above your elbow. So it's quite a close call on this pattern. I'm just going to measure it up, and I'm quite short in the body. So if I use that sleeve as it is, then right on my elbow join, I will have quite a narrow part of the sleeve. I want that sleeve to finish above my elbow, so that my elbow and all the movement is within the bell sleeve. So I'm going to take 2 centimetres off there, but it's another measurement to check before you cut out the pattern, because if you look at the picture, that upper sleeve needs to finish just above your elbow, so that the elbow's got movement within the bell sleeve. On Style Arc patterns and lots of other patterns, you insert a sleeve by sewing up the side seams and making your armhole, and then you sew your sleeve piece together and make the tube of the sleeve to slip into the hole, and in this case then make another tube, which is the bell shape, and attach that to the lower sleeve. That's lots of circles fitting within circles, and that's okay, and you pin them and you ease the stitches in, but I like to fit my sleeves flat, so I'm going to show you how to do that. Then if you want to try the flat method, you can, and if you want to just continue with the instructions and fit each shape into the next one, that's fine too. Before you match up the sleeves into the armhole, you're going to put a little row of easing stitches in the sleeve head. So that's a large stitch length on your machine around here, just through the one layer, and if you pull them up you will just gather in some of that fullness around the curve of the sleeve head. You're not trying to make it gathered, you're just trying to get it to pop up like that, and that would give it a more 3D shape on your shoulder. So you end up with that shape there. Put your top right side up so that you can see the arm side, and you're going to find the right sleeve for the side. So with right sides together, you're going to put the little notch in the sleeve that indicates the front of the sleeve that goes on the front of the top. If you put them in backwards, you'll get funny ripples around your armhole. So make sure you've got the right sleeve for the right side. So you match the end, match the notch, keep moving along to find the one for the sleeve head. Keep the seams open on the shoulder seam so that it all stays nice and flat. You don't get a little bump on your shoulder. And you just keep putting the curve shape onto the curved edge. It's quite a bit easier to manipulate than if you're trying to do it in a circle. I've got my pins vertical so that I can take in some of the slack, and I'll be putting more pins around the sleeve head because I want to just make sure that I'm taking the fullness of that sleeve head and creating a 3D shape. More pins the better in a sleeve. Sew the sleeve in with a 1 centimetre seam allowance and then repeat for the other side. Right, so my sleeve is attached, and now I can take the bottom sleeve, the bell bit of the sleeve, and join that on. There isn't a right way for this to go, it just goes on. Sometimes on another pattern you might find there's a particular way to put it on to get the drape, but this is just a symmetrical piece so it can go straight on. So everything now is going on flat, whereas I would be trying to get this bell shape to fit on the end of my sleeve in a circle. So I'm going to sew along here. There's your side seam and your upper sleeve here and your bell shape at the end. So now I'm going to sew up the side seam, down the sleeve and down the bell, but not all the way to the bottom. There is a split at the end, so I need to make sure that I stop to allow for that little split at the end. So that's how I've been putting in my sleeve, because it's much easier than fitting tubes into tubes. Number 12 is to hem the body. So you've got a 1 centimetre seam allowance to put around the hem, and you also got 1 centimetre to narrow hem around the edge of the bell sleeve. So to get that hem, you need to do a little clip, and it shows it you in the diagram, but it doesn't explain it in the instructions. So where you had your stop point for the slit, you're going to make a snip in the seam allowances so that the seam allowance above the slit can remain flat and open, and the seam allowance below can be used for turning under. So you need to turn half a centimetre and then half a centimetre again, and pin your hem all the way around. It helps if you do your first turn of your double folded hem with an iron, and then the rest, the second fold, you can do from here. So it's easier if you've got a little fold, it just stops it bubbling. So you're going to sew from the slit all the way around the bell sleeve and back to the slit, and then across the seam allowance. You're going to do a double folded hem on the hem as well. So you will press up and then press up again, and that's a double folded hem. Don't underestimate how long it will take you to handle that hem. It is quite tricky. It's a floaty fabric. You're taking quite a small seam allowance around there, and you need to make sure that you go backwards and forwards across that there, but you should have a nice slightly curved hem edge, and you will need to press it out, because when you take it out from under the machine you'll think, oh my gosh, it's all wrinkly, but actually it just needs a really good press. The last thing to do is to, if you haven't done it already, is to just hand sew your neck facings to your shoulder seams so that they don't flap out. That's just a quick job at the end. And your top is finished. Here's the top. You can see more of the shape, so there's lots of ease in the hip, so it can be quite a swinging top, and it's very fitted on the shoulders. We were wondering about the shoulders at the start, but you can see it is just actually a really neat fit on the shoulders. It's worth measuring that though. I probably could have had a little tiny bit more. It's not affected the shape, but it's worth checking for you. But you can see that my shoulder seam, because it's right on my shoulder, then my back neck isn't gaping. As for the sleeves, there they are, really rather beautiful. And you can see now why it's worth taking some time to finish that inside properly, because you're going to see that. So that's why hemming the sleeves needs a little bit of extra time. And you can also see why I chose the fabric, because then you can see that white and it doesn't detract from the pebble path pattern. If that was a black background and it was white inside, it might be slightly distracting. I'm so glad I took 2 centimeters off the upper sleeve, because there's my elbow join. So I've got all of that movement in my elbow, and that tight bit isn't then over where I need it to have the most room. Today's sew along accompanies the Harlow top kit. All of the items are listed below. I hope you enjoyed the sew along today. It's a top which I think is great for beginners or improving beginners, because the work on the sleeve there needs to be quite accurate, but the rest is a construction of a shell top. You could also make the top with just without the floating sleeve, and you could adjust the sleeve length to the way that you like to wear your tops. Thank you very much for watching. Do call again soon, but in the meantime do head over to Minerva to take a look at some more of our tutorials, inspirational makers and the products on our website. Thanks very much for watching. See you again soon.